What's an alien movie without xenomorphs? How many doomed reboots has Universal attempted? And how does Uwe Boll keep getting jobs? There's nothing like a good scare to get moviegoers excited, but these horror movies prove that you can't buy success with a big budget. Guillermo del Toro's 2015 gothic romance Crimson Peak is a lush, haunting love story with sumptuous special effects and a killer cast. Those things aren't cheap, of course, and the film was made using a decent-sized $55 million budget. Crimson Peak was marketed as the next great horror film from one of the genre's finest minds, but that marketing likely hurt the film instead of helping it. Fans expected screams, but they instead got a slow-burning story of dread with a few ghosts tossed in for flavor. The film only brought in $31 million in the United States. It went on to make back its budget worldwide, but was a pretty major disappointment overall. It's a shame, too, because Crimson Peak is a phenomenal film. The cast is filled with bona fide stars and the premise is fascinating, but most audiences just weren't interested in a Victorian-era horror story that stays true to its gothic roots. Indeed, Crimson Peak feels as if an entire semester of Victorian literature had been crammed into its 2-hour runtime, giving viewers a taste of all the genre has to offer, from Robert Louis Stevenson to Mary Shelley. The central romance is appropriately restrained for much of the movie's runtime too, something 21st century audiences might not have the patience for. If Crimson Peak had been marketed as a twisted gothic romance instead of a standard horror film, it might have still had poor box office returns, but at least people would have known what they were in for. As it stands though, Crimson Peak is Del Toro at his best, and this ghostly tragedy deserves to be treasured. If A Cure for Wellness was another knife in the heart for mid-budget studio movies, then at least it made its lavish $40 million budget count. Gore Verbinski's hypnotic tale opens in the way that many early horror stories did, with a pale young bureaucrat sent to a grand old building in a remote location, where dark secrets lurk inside its walls. There, he becomes entranced by a girl who is as pale and unhealthy looking as he is, Hannah, the youngest long-term patient at a sanatorium. A Cure for Wellness is very much the sister film of Crimson Peak, which was released a couple of years previously. Both are big, indulgent, melodramatic gothic horror tales with a delightfully nasty edge. Both are woefully underrated too, and both bombed at the box office. A Cure for Wellness ultimately grossed a mere $26.6 million, well below what it cost to make, never mind the cost of marketing and distribution. Part of this box office disaster might be attributed to competition in the horror genre from Jordan Peele's Get Out, which released a week after A Cure for Wellness and eventually made nearly 10 times as much money. And while it's also true that anticipation for Get Out may have eclipsed interest in A Cure for Wellness, the similar downfall of Crimson Peak suggests that general audiences just really weren't in the mood for old-fashioned spooky stories at the time. If you missed out on it though, A Cure for Wellness is well worth a visit. It may come as no surprise to you that the Shining sequel, Dr. Sleep, didn't do so hot at the box office. But the 2019 film has nevertheless garnered a reputation as a widely liked movie with a strong following. This installment follows Ewan McGregor as a grown-up Danny Torrance, as he recovers from alcoholism and returns to his gift of shine. It was made in a $45 million budget, but the film only grossed $72 million total for its entire theatrical run. Considering how much money was spent on the project, those returns come up short in comparison to what producers were undoubtedly hoping to make. It's clear the team behind the movie was banking on the iconography of The Shining to carry the film to the bank. Sadly, it seems that audiences were initially put off by the fact that key characters, such as Jack Nicholson's Jack and Shelley Duvall's Wendy, were recast for flashbacks and other pivotal scenes. Because of this, the film failed to shine at the box office. That doesn't mean it's not worth your time, though. Despite failing with general audiences, you'd be hard-pressed to find a cinephile who doesn't go to bat for this picture. Between the top-notch acting, the expansive world-building, and the tantalizingly Kubrickian callbacks.
Great party, isn't it?
Some would even argue that Dr. Sleep stands as one of the best sequels in the horror genre. When it comes to totally unjustified box office flops, no recent example feels more fitting than The Empty Man. A heady, heart-pounding slice of supernatural horror, the film packs ample style and substance throughout its 137-minute runtime. But it was just met with too many obstacles to truly thrive. Based on the graphic novel of the same name, The Empty Man is the feature directorial debut of David Pryor, who previously directed supplemental documentary shorts for DVD releases of everything from Panic Room to Zodiac. Though the film adaptation was greenlit in 2016 with Pryor attached to direct, it would take well over 4 years before the film hit theaters due to a litany of issues. Set to complete principal photography in the early winter months of 2017, the final week of shooting was pushed back due to inclement weather and Executive Vice President Mark Roybal's departure from 20th Century Fox. Shooting finally resumed and concluded in the fall of 2017, but the imminent Disney-Fox merger only pushed The Empty Man back further. Unceremoniously released in theaters on October 23, 2020, after one final pandemic-related delay, The Empty Man grossed less than $5 million worldwide. Not a lot to show for roughly 56 months of work and a $16 million budget. Despite all of this, The Empty Man has cemented itself as a horror cult classic, heralded by genre enthusiasts as an inventive, intelligent, and incredibly scary gem that couldn't be smacked down, no matter how bad things became. Given how it's now widely regarded as one of the greatest horror movies of all time, you might be surprised to learn that John Carpenter's The Thing was not a box office success upon its initial release. Made with a budget of $15 million and largely filmed on location in Alaska and British Columbia, The Thing landed quietly at the box office. It debuted at number 8 in its opening weekend and grossed just $19.6 million at the North American box office by the end of its run. How could such a now acclaimed horror movie have performed so poorly? Well, both critics and audiences at the time kind of hated it. In an interview with Creative Screenwriting, Carpenter recalled, "The critics thought the movie was boring and didn't allow for any hope. That was the part they really hammered on." But the director knew in advance that the movie was in trouble when Universal Pictures did test screenings for The Thing, and the reaction was less than positive. As Carpenter explained, "There was one young gal who asked, 'Well, what happened in the very end? Which one was the Thing and which one was the good guy?' And I said, 'Well, you have to use your imagination.' And she said, 'Oh God, I hate that. We were dead. Dead in the water. Dead. Horrible.'" Fortunately, things don't always stay dead in the horror genre. Like many 80s horror movies, The Thing found its audience in the blossoming market of home media, where avid genre fans enthusiastically shared recommendations for video nasties. There, the gruesome special effects and ambiguous ending that had alienated general audiences instead became a selling point, and The Thing finally thrived.
Why don't we just wait here for a little while? See what happens.
Paul W.S. Anderson's name may be popularly associated with the Resident Evil franchise, but it's Event Horizon that gets the director the most full-throated praise among modern horror fans. That certainly wasn't true when the movie premiered in 1997, however, as the $60 million film took in only $26.6 million at the domestic box office. The cosmic horror tale of a starship that disappears in its maiden voyage and comes back full of hellish mystery. This mind-bending film was lambasted by critics at the time, but has since received wider positive reappraisal. When Event Horizon was in production, Paramount's co-produced movie Titanic was running over schedule and over budget, and the studio needed to put a film in its summer slot. To make the deadline, instead of the DGA guaranteed 10 weeks of editing, Anderson agreed to 6 weeks, which in practice became 4. The resulting 130-minute cut shocked both test audiences and the studio with its rampant violence and bloated runtime. Paramount then overcorrected, forcing a 90-minute cut that removed a number of major scenes. The bungled theatrical cut was matched by the studio's choice to market it as a slightly darker Star Trek, leading audiences to expect much different things from the mind-bending, bloody theatrical release.
The reality is much, much worse.
The film's post-theatrical reappraisal began almost immediately, however, with a successful DVD home release, and the movie's reputation has only improved as the years have passed. After a series of successes with Total Recall and Basic Instinct, filmmaker Paul Verhoeven was hit by a set of critical and box office duds. 1995's lurid Showgirls underperformed at the box office, while 1997's widely misunderstood Starship Troopers only did a little better. After this row of surprising failures, Verhoeven took a foray into horror with 2000's Hollow Man, a movie starring Kevin Bacon as a scientist who volunteers to be the test subject of an invisibility serum. The film ended with a profitable but tepid $191 million, outing on a $90 million budget. It certainly hit nowhere near his string of box office home runs, and also received a notoriously poor critical reception. To this day, Hollow Man remains the first of his movies that Verhoeven says he should not have made. So what went wrong? At their best, Paul Verhoeven's films are best thought of as high-concept id films, loaded with sex and violence with a fun and intelligent edge. By contrast, Hollow Man is a relatively bland and straightforward film, markedly different from the creative and engaging sci-fi outings for which the director had become known. He stated in later interviews that the film was studio-dominated and admittedly lacked his personal touch. Gone are the intelligent extravagances of his more characteristic films, thanks largely to studio interference. The end result is a film lacking Verhoeven's style that feels comparably forgettable by contrast. The 2017 Tom Cruise vehicle, The Mummy, bombed so severely that it effectively killed a franchise before it could get off the ground. Though the title will lead most movie fans to think of the 1999 film, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, the monster itself was part of the first iteration of Universal's horror slate, initially appearing in the 1932 movie of the same name.
For heaven's sakes, what is it?
He went for a little walk. You should have seen his face.
However, with the overwhelming success of franchises like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Universal thought they'd whip up their own interconnected universe, dubbed the Dark Universe. Unfortunately, they chose a bloated, action-heavy, and horror-light mummy movie to kick things off. Though the film ended up grossing $329 million internationally, the overall box office turnout stopped this would-be monster mash well before the party started. The Mummy teases characters clearly connected to other horror tales, and there were several other high-profile names preemptively associated with the Dark Universe, such as Javier Bardem, who was set to play Frankenstein's monster. Now, though, with the success of Leigh Whannell's Universal monster remake The Invisible Man, Universal has chosen to team up with Blumhouse to create low-budget, artistically driven reimaginings instead. Hopefully, it goes a little better. There was palpable excitement in 2012 as Prometheus, the movie that saw director Ridley Scott returning to the Alien franchise after more than 30 years, hit theaters. But the results left audiences divided, as the actual xenomorphs, the trademark aliens of the franchise, don't really appear in the movie. Despite that, Prometheus did pretty solid business, grossing $403 million at the global box office. So, Fox opted to pursue a sequel with Scott once again in the director's chair. The script for what would eventually be called Alien Covenant went through several iterations. Earlier in the film's development, Scott had referred to it as Alien Paradise Lost, but the film's title soon changed along with the story. In the end, we got a movie that did indeed deliver xenomorphs, with a marketing campaign that leaned heavily on their appearance. This was being sold as a proper Alien movie through and through. Be that as it may, the final film failed to capture the attention of the masses when it hit theaters in the summer of 2017, taking in just $240 million worldwide against a budget of $97 million. While there are certainly more disastrous outcomes financially, this fell well short of expectations and left the theatrical viability of the franchise in question. To this day, fans have yet to see a sequel, despite Covenant ending on a cliffhanger. Sadly, audiences may have felt a little burned by Prometheus, and the lack of must-see reviews from critics just didn't help the case for Covenant, despite the best efforts of Scott and Fox. 2004's Van Helsing was given a whopping $170 million budget, and thanks to a solid performance internationally, managed to bring home over $300 million at the box office. While these numbers would typically indicate a sign of success, the dollar amount wasn't high enough to fulfill Universal's plans to reboot their Universal Monsters universe, especially after being met with relentlessly horrible reviews. Hugh Jackman stars as famed monster slayer Gabriel Van Helsing, who is sent off to Transylvania to defeat Count Dracula. Unfortunately, Kate Beckinsale's Anna Valerius informs him that Dracula has formed an alliance with Dr. Frankenstein's monster, and the duo must team up to defeat them before they can enact a centuries-old curse on the Valerius family. Blending the worlds of two of Universal's most prized monsters, and featuring many more to boot, felt like a license to print money. But the hype was destroyed when audiences showed up to the theater and were met with an overuse of CGI and Richard Roxburgh's laughably bad accent as Count Dracula.
Oh, Gabriel. Welcome to my summer palace.
While Van Helsing's heart was clearly in the right place, the movie is a chaotic mess of too many ideas thrown together, and not even the charm of Hugh Jackman could save it. Boasting a 24% on Rotten Tomatoes, Van Helsing was so poorly received that it scared off Universal from pursuing their Monsterverse, realizing how lucky they were to have turned a profit on such a stinker. Virus sounds like a 1999 horror movie Mad Lib. An invading alien attacks a Russian space station and beams itself aboard a Russian research vessel in the South Pacific, then uses electricity to turn all of the people aboard into cyborg slaves. A tugboat crew composed of Jamie Lee Curtis, Donald Sutherland, and William Baldwin discovers the vessel and sneaks aboard to scavenge any sellable parts. What happens next is pure mayhem. Of course, Curtis is a horror household name, and the story is just weird enough to work. So why did Virus only make around $30 million worldwide on a $75 million budget? Well, sometimes a bad movie is just a bad movie. Virus is a mostly incomprehensible mess that even received one of Roger Ebert's most negative reviews of all time. The cinematography and lighting are haphazard, making entire scenes difficult to see. Even Curtis has been outspoken about just how bad Virus is, telling IGN in 2003, "Virus is so bad that it's shocking." That would be the all-time piece of It's just dreadful. While some fans over the years have defended Virus as a cult classic, the kind that's so bad it's good, it turns out most folks are in Curtis and Ebert's camp and think this one's just a stinker. Remakes are nothing new in Hollywood, but they can be especially dangerous when tackling a piece of legitimate cinema history. Such was the case with Universal's 2010 remake of The Wolfman, which starred Benicio del Toro and Anthony Hopkins in one of the most expensive horror movies ever produced, with a reported production budget of $150 million. The result was also one of the most notable box office disasters of the last 15 years, if not ever. Mark Romanek had been scheduled to direct the movie up until the very last minute, but he became embroiled in debates with the studio, in part over the amount of time needed to make the film. Joe Johnston was subsequently brought in to handle things, and the Rocketeer filmmaker found himself in an equally messy situation. Constant script changes kept necessitating reshoots and changes during the editing process. Cuts were made in an attempt to save money that, in the end, ended up costing the studio more money due to necessary reshoots and retooling. Against a wave of negative reviews, the movie earned a grand total of just $139 million globally, failing even to recoup its budget. Despite having Oscar-winning visual effects and an A-list cast, the mess behind the scenes ultimately led to financial ruin. Much like the Wolfman himself, this one seemed to be straight-up cursed. Uwe Boll has sustained an impressive run of box office bombs without suffering any repercussions. His obsession with video game adaptations has become something of a signature, such as the critically detested shoot-'em-up House of the Dead. But that's not even his mightiest box office failure. Christian Slater's and Tara Reid's star power wasn't enough to save 2005's Alone in the Dark from a worldwide whimper of $10 million on a $20 million budget.
That's because they don't know the truth.
Things only got worse with Boll's adaptation of the fantasy vampire franchise, BloodRayne. This monumental flop cost more money to make than Alone in the Dark, but made just $3 million at the global box office. Alone in the Dark is a more straightforward case of atrocious reviews dooming a release that Lionsgate inherited after purchasing Artisan Entertainment. BloodRayne's failure is a little more complicated, given how Boll went into business with supporting cast member Billy Zane, who had just opened the distribution company Romar Entertainment. They promised Boll BloodRayne would screen in 2,000 theaters, but reports indicate that Romar Entertainment only managed around 985 screens, and that a few hundred of those establishments didn't even play the film due to miscommunications with Romar. BloodRayne is officially the only botched release for Romar Entertainment, too, because the company closed its doors shortly after. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more SlashFilm videos about your favorite horror movies are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.